What I'd like to do this morning is just firstly say something about the motivations behind this particular call, and then try to give you some suggestions about things to think about in making your application, certain issues that you need to be aware of and incorporate in some way or respond to in some way in your applications. But firstly, just thinking a little bit about the motivations for this particular theme. This was as Mark has already indicated, this is the second joint research program that the HERA Consortium has run. And our motivation this time was really to try to find a theme which would be broad enough to incorporate all the humanities disciplines, and in saying humanities, I am also, as Mark has indicated, including the arts and humanities. Broad enough to encompass all the humanities, but still having some kind of focus, some kind of thematic, if you like, framework, and one which would be as topical now as it has been through all of human history, which is why we sort of settled, one of the reasons we settled on the idea of cultural encounters, something which now, as much as ever, has been crucial, has been a crucial aspect of human history, and the understanding of the complexities and the tensions and the energies and possibilities that arise when one culture comes into contact with another, whether now or in the past, in Europe or elsewhere, at the levels of language, art, trade, education, or any other sphere, seemed to us to be a very crucial area to explore. In fact, from the perspective of humanities and arts research, cultural encounters seemed to be something that radiated with multiple possibilities. For us in the HERA Consortium, the new program has both a general purpose or set of purposes and also more specific ones. And in terms of the general purpose, which is to do with the larger frame of European research funding, partly this program, as with our previous programs, was intended to redress the relative invisibility of humanities research in the thematic European funding schemes, which is an invisibility that may to some extent reflect on ourselves as humanities scholars and sometimes not always taking or seeing the opportunities that do exist for participation in European project funding. But also it is a reflection, I think, on a certain unwillingness sometimes or a certain kind of lack of awareness or even failure perhaps on the part of funders and policymakers to firstly acknowledge the real and fundamental value of the humanities to the well-being and improvement of society, no less than science or medicine or any other field. Secondly, to recognize that humanities research does not fit neatly into the paradigms of other disciplines, including the social sciences sometimes, including the physical sciences. And therefore, humanities research needs somewhat different forms of description and measurement and evaluation. And thirdly, to include sufficient humanities-centered themes in the framework program over the past number of years. In other words, that there's been, an absence of humanities-centered themes in the framework programs. And it's true that sometimes humanities are mentioned as desirable partners in some of the themes and topics of the framework programs at a European level, but humanities disciplines have not to date been foregrounded, nor are the framework programs designed to be humanities-led. So we're reacting to that kind of environment in HERA, and as well as working to steer the European research agenda in ways that are more hospitable to what we do as humanities scholars, we also need to be clear and forceful in articulating to our national policymakers and our fellow citizens, in fact, why culture matters and why humanities research, whose special province is the understanding and interpretation of culture, is itself a crucial form of knowledge. And why does culture matter? In a room like this, I don't need to explain this. I don't need to preach to the converted. But, in a fundamental way, culture is an expression of the joys, hopes, doubts, and agonies of being human, a very fundamental thing, both as individuals in the world and as members of collective identities that give us strength and enable us to feel at home. It's a fundamental vehicle for the articulation and transmission of our most deeply held values. It's also an arena in which we can test those values and innovate ideas and practices. Lip service is sometimes paid these days to the value of culture by our contemporary economically driven discourses, as if it's a kind of luxury or a pastime, a matter of superstructure or a commodity that's valuable insofar as it can be translated into profits or employability. But as humanities scholars, we know that culture is the very core of our existence as humans, and always has been. Our cultural lives, the languages we use, the beliefs we commit to, the narratives we make and share, the imaginative works and artifacts through which we explain and entertain, the emotional and intellectual lives that we explore through all of these forms, all of these things are fundamental and in the end inseparable from our economic selves and our political beings, however complicated those relationships might be. Culture is an industry, it's true, but its function and value is not reducible to that. And culture, like humanity, is nomadic. It is therefore a constant site of encounters with otherness and with difference, constantly in flux and constantly challenged. Sometimes these encounters produce conflict and hostility. Sometimes they involve processes of maintaining otherness in forms that range from colonialism to tourism. But sometimes cultural encounters are catalysts for the emergence of new, hybrid, and enriching forms of identity and practice, new synergies. The theme of cultural encounters was one we chose because it allows researchers to focus on this crucial and complicated dimension of our lives, and one that has clear importance to our contemporary geopolitics. But it's also sufficiently broad and capacious enough to be hospitable to the entire range of the humanities, of all of our disciplines, and even some disciplines beyond the humanities, social sciences, environmental science, medicine, and so on. It's important that we keep a steady gaze on the multiplicity of consequences that arise in the wake of cultural encounters. We know, for example, that European colonialism led to encounters which were quite often literally death-dealing, bringing disease, war, environmental destruction. But we also know that trade and exchange among dispersed cultures provided forms of enrichment. Post-colonial European and cross-cultural migrations have led to profound cultural innovations in art, music, philosophy, social life, science, technology, and even in the context of this building today, fashion and design are obviously areas in which cultural encounters have proved hugely productive and influential. Religious practices sometimes bring people together and divide others. Sometimes cultural encounters do produce conflict, intolerance, exploitation. There are good news stories and bad news stories, and sometimes the same story has both good and bad parts. We know a great many of these stories already, but there is still so much more to know and so much more thinking to be done about what we find, and that's one of the purposes of this HERA JRP. The point is that we need to make the point we need to make, I suppose, as humanities researchers, is that culture is pervasive, indispensable, and complex, and it is humanities above all, and the arts, who are uniquely qualified to help us understand it. So, in general terms, partly the thinking behind this HERA project is that to truly understand the dynamics of cultural encounters, we have to think historically. We must see individual phenomena not just in the short term, but in the longue durée. We need narratives of causes and consequences that unfold over time. We must also be able to range widely, geographically, spatially, drawing upon the breadth of our knowledge of different languages, customs, and locations. We need to measure and assess the impact of space, environment, and spatial relationships. We need to think about the vehicles of cultural encounters, language, media, literature, art, music, but also institutions and organizations. We need to understand the subtleties and complications of how they work, both as facilitators of and barriers to, sometimes, cultural encounter. But we must also think theoretically. How can we best conceptualize and generalize in ways that enable us to be predictive, or to make valid comparisons, or to see patterns of behavior and experience beyond the merely contingent? How do we think through the role of ideas and the ideological? And, theoretically speaking too, what is culture anyway? What exactly is its place and function in human life? How is it connected to the political, the economic, the psychological, the environmental? Humanities provide the tools and methodologies for all of these things.